Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. My name is Kate. I am the co-yoga director of Yoga Renewal, and I'm so excited to be here on this Facebook Live to talk about a topic that we get asked all the time, which is what is the difference between Hatha yoga and Vinyasa yoga? Our 200-hour yoga teacher training is an all styles, certified as an all styles yoga training where we specialize in teaching these two. What's unique about us is that we actually think that the sequencing structure that you can apply to your classes and that we teach inside of our training works for both a Hatha style class and a Vinyasa style class with a few key differences. And so I want to talk about what those differences are because both styles are taught so broadly, and I think the information that you're learning inside of our training can be applied to both. So let's go over a few of the key differences between Hatha style classes and Vinyasa style classes. So in our minds, the biggest misconception I think about Hatha yoga is that it gets kind of wrapped in with this idea of always having a bit more of a gentle feel to it. And I think that that can be true depending on the level of class that it is, but it doesn't have to be true. In our mindset, you can still have Hatha classes that are varying levels all the way up to advanced classes where you're working on very advanced poses, but in the Hatha style. And really what it comes down to in terms of the difference between Hatha yoga and Vinyasa yoga are two key things. The first is what the home base for your sequence is, meaning where do you really cue all of your poses from? In a Hatha class, those poses would get cued from Tadasana at the front of your mat. So as you move throughout your sequence of standing poses, you're going to bring your students to Tadasana, do your sequence on each side, bring them back to Tadasana, do it on the left side, and then repeat that for the remainder of your sequence, right? Tadasana, mountain pose, is your home base at the front of your mat. For a Vinyasa class, the home base is downward facing dog because the engine of a Vinyasa class are your sun salutations. So that breath to breath movement that Vinyasa yoga is known for is a direct result of sun salutations where you're linking one pose to one breath. And that continues throughout a Vinyasa class through flowy creative transitions. And so that downward facing dog position where you're then able to move through like the flow part of a class, coming from down dog, moving to plank, to chaturanga, to up dog, back to down dog, brings you back to your home base. So in a Vinyasa class, you're going to be cueing your poses from down dog. So lift your right leg, step it forward, open up, you do all your standing poses on one side, get back to down dog, lift your left leg, step forward, do all of that on the opposite side. And then you move through your class that way. So the home base for a Hatha class is Tadasana. For a Vinyasa class would be downward facing dog. So key difference number one. The other key difference, and I touched on that briefly just now, is the way that you transition and move through poses. In a Hatha class, and what we teach inside of our course, we're teaching you Iyengar yoga alignment and applying that to the Hatha class setting. You're looking at each pose a bit more statically. So taking a look at your standing poses, saying, okay, let's take a look at triangle pose, setting up the alignment of triangle pose, and then staying in that pose for a longer period of time. Slowing down the pacing of the class, really taking the time to hone in on the alignment of that individual pose and hold it for 5, 10, 15 breaths. Coming up, then moving maybe to another pose that's linked to triangle, right? Maybe from triangle, you come back to warrior two, but then you come back to Tadasana and then would look at another pose after, right? So there's almost more of a workshop type feel in a Hatha class where you're taking the time to really look at the alignment truly of each individual pose. And the goal of the Hatha class is to find a bit more stillness, grounding in those poses, and to really settle in and work with some of the more minute alignment in those poses. In a Vinyasa class, you're moving more with the focus on linking each pose to the breath, to an inhale and an exhale. So the poses are linked in this flowy manner where one pose flows directly into another as opposed to looking at poses statically. So in that situation, for example, it would be something like you're in warrior two, you want to get to triangle pose. Rather than take everybody to the middle of the mat, hop the feet wide, externally rotate the leg to come into triangle like you would in a hatha class. In a vinyasa class, you're going to say from warrior two, straighten your leg, bring your arm down, triangle pose. Be here for a breath or two, reach the arm over your head, lower your hands down, downward facing dog, and then do the whole other side. So in a vinyasa class, it's more about the intricacy of the transitions between poses and linking the poses to the breath than it is in a hatha class. As a result, the pacing of a vinyasa class is a little bit faster because you're really working to try to link each movement to either an inhale or an exhale, maybe holding a pose for like 3 to 5 breaths maximum before then moving through the transitions to move on to your next pose. As a result, in your classes, if you're building out a sequence, a vinyasa class is going to include a lot more poses in one class than a hatha class. And it's just due to the pacing. It doesn't mean that the poses in a vinyasa class are going to be harder or more challenging. It just means that you're not going to hold them as long, right? So typically when I move through the standing rounds in my vinyasa class, we might do triangle pose 3 times because we're going to do it in my round 1, in my round 2, in my round 3 of my vinyasa classes, where we're going to be there. We're going to hold it maybe 3 breaths, and then we're going to revisit it again. And as a result, my sequence is longer on paper because I'm seeing those poses more than one time, versus in a hatha class, if I'm going to hold that triangle pose for 5, 10, 15 breaths, I won't have as much time to add in so many additional poses. So the poses that you're choosing for each class, depending on the level, working up to a peak pose, are still going to be similar, right? If you're trying to teach leading your way into headstand for your students, right? You're going to teach them how to do headstand. The same prep poses are needed for both a hatha and a vinyasa class. In headstand, we need to work and open up the shoulders and the upper back. We need to activate the core, teach people how to activate the transverse abdominal muscles to lift the belly in and up and make sure that the front body is supporting that straight spine and the inversion, how to use 2 straight legs. So the same actions need to happen to do headstand in both a hatha and in a vinyasa. It's just that the amount of times that you might visit that pose and how you get into it is different. So in a hatha class, those key poses that might help lead up to headstand are going to be there, but you're going to focus on holding them for, like I said, 5, 10, 15 breaths, really getting into the alignment, really working on fully engaging all muscles into that pose for the time that you're settled in. In a vinyasa class, it's more about linking the poses with the breath. And of course, you're still going to do it with proper alignment, keeping it safe, giving students a way to be able to still learn all of those prep poses. It's just that the approach and the focus is different, right? It's more about that flowy movement, linking movement to breath, versus in a hatha class, the breath is there once you're settled into a pose, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every single movement is coordinated with an inhale or an exhale. Okay, so hopefully you're with me on that. As a result, though, I think another key difference, so that's like the approach to sequencing hatha and vinyasa, the differences, right? Home base in a hatha is Tadasana, home base in vinyasa is downward facing dog. In a hatha class, poses are looked at more statically and held for a bit longer. In a vinyasa class, poses are linked and you're moving a little bit more quickly because you're linking it inhale, exhale. Key differences from a sequencing perspective. Energetically, this creates a difference between hatha and a vinyasa class. Hatha classes tend to be a bit more grounding, stabilizing, solid, because you're really taking the time to settle into a pose. Vinyasa classes tend to have a bit more of an energetic and uplifting quality. Both are amazing, just different, right? And for you as a teacher, depending on the style of class that you really love to teach, and maybe you like to teach both, it's just important to understand that the different types of classes can attract a different type of student in terms of what they're looking for. In my experience, what someone is expecting out of a hatha class is a little bit more of that grounded quality energetically, is a bit more of that slower pace. Versus when students come to a vinyasa class, they're expecting to move and to be able to flow with their breath and kind of get lost in that meditation as movement type thing. So the expectation of your students can be really different depending on what style of class you're teaching. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that, because oftentimes when I talk to students of yoga who might not necessarily know what the difference is between a class, they show up to a studio because they're traveling or whatever, and they attend a hatha class, whereas at home they usually practice vinyasa yoga. And they might say like, oh, if the class moves so slowly for me, or vice versa. Someone usually practices in an Iyengar hatha type style, and then they travel and take a vinyasa class and like, oh my gosh, the class moved way too fast. And it doesn't mean that it was wrong. It just means that the expectation was different for that student in terms of what they're expecting out of a yoga class. And there is a difference between the two styles, right? Both from a sequencing perspective and from an energetic perspective as well. I think the key thing is being able to communicate clearly what type of class you're going to teach. So labeling it either a vinyasa flow class or a hatha style class. If you're teaching weekly, staying consistent with the type of class that you're offering, and also making sure that the class description shares that, right? In a hatha, it might be a bit more, this class moves through poses, focusing on the alignment and, really settling in to hold the pose and create this energetic grounding quality. Vinyasa class, you can expect to flow breath to breath between poses. Getting clarity around your class description and the naming of your class, and then remaining consistent to that, is a really good way to make sure that you're adhering or fulfilling the expectations of the students walking in, that their expectations are set appropriately, and then that you as a teacher are fulfilling those expectations, which is going to make everybody have a more successful experience throughout class. And then of course, the other key piece of this is making sure that you're teaching to the appropriate level, right? So a beginner or level 1 vinyasa class should still be a vinyasa class. You should still be linking pose to pose, moving breath to breath. The pacing might slow down a little bit because you're working with newer students. And so your cues have to be tailored a little bit more specifically, but poses should still be linked and you should still find that flowy nature. Similarly, in a hatha class, if you're teaching a level 1, it's just that you're going to pick a level 1 peak pose and maybe not be working students up to advanced inversions or arm balances like you might in a level 2 or an advanced level class. So I think the success of teachers comes from understanding the difference between the two, understanding which type of class you're offering, naming it and describing it appropriately, and then showing up to teach the appropriate level in the style that you're committing to teaching. At our studios, we have teachers that teach both styles, that make sure that like on Tuesday morning, they're teaching the hatha style or Iyengar class, and then on Thursday night, they teach a vinyasa class. It's just that the class is labeled as such, right? So students understand the expectation. Then we also have teachers at our headquarters that specialize in really teaching one style of yoga, right? They might be really, truly focused on just teaching vinyasa or just teaching in a more hatha style. So we offer at the headquarters here for Yoga Renew an Iyengar class with Deirdre, who, if you haven't taken her classes on our YouTube, I highly recommend. She's fantastic. You can look her up. And on our Yoga Renew online, she teaches on there as well. But she's a certified Iyengar teacher, and she teaches Iyengar yoga on Wednesdays and Sunday mornings, I believe, for us. And so when you come to Deirdre's classes, that's the style that she teaches. She's a certified Iyengar teacher. It's an Iyengar hatha style class. Then we have other teachers that only teach vinyasa yoga. So they're not teaching hatha classes. And if you come to their class, it's labeled vinyasa, and that's the style of class that they're committed to. I think for you as a teacher, you just need to decide, are you going to teach both styles? Are you going to focus on one and start to get really into the sequencing that goes into planning a vinyasa or a hatha class? Or do you want to teach both and just make sure that your classes are appropriately labeled and consistently labeled in terms of their offerings? And I think that that's the key to being able to grow your classes and attract the students to your classes that you want to have, is just letting them know which style it is and making sure that they consistently can expect you to show up and teach that style. So think that kind of covers it. Just going through in our minds, really the difference between Hatha and Vinyasa. A lot of it just comes down to transitions and the expectation. Hatha being that you're going to look more statically at the poses, you're going to breathe in the poses for a bit longer, that the home base is going to be Tadasana and the focus is going to be on alignment. Vinyasa, the focus going to be on the breath and the transitions and the flow between poses, and your home base is going to be downward facing dog. But the sequencing principles, and that you're going to lead up to a peak pose and choose poses in your sequence that help to prep you to get there, are going to be the same. So yeah, that wraps it up. The difference between Hatha and Vinyasa yoga. If you have questions about this, like any follow-up or any of that, please, of course, always feel free to reach out to us. We are here to be a resource and to support you on this journey as you're learning and growing as a teacher. And I appreciate so much anyone who's watching this live with me, and of course, anyone who is catching the replay. Thank you for taking the time to do this. And we are just so grateful for this Yoga Renew community. So thanks for being here. Let me know what other questions you have. Also, let us know what other topics you would like for us to cover in more of these lives or expert chats coming your way. The more that you communicate to us how we can help you and teach you, the better the content is that we can put out there. So we're here, let us know. We're real people behind this, and we want to answer the questions that you have and make sure that we're showing up to serve you in the best way possible as you move throughout our trainings. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you again soon.